In 2006, Carol Chase McElheney was driving south along the 215 freeway in Southern California. Picture clear skies, dry heat, the kind of afternoon where the sunlight feels baked into the pavement, like the day has been sitting there waiting for you. Daniel Powter's Bad Day played softly on the radio, a little on the nose in hindsight. And Carol knew this road. She'd driven it for years. She could have taken these exits on muscle memory alone. But somewhere between boredom and nostalgia, she made a decision. A small one, the kind that shouldn't matter. I'll stop in Riverside, she thought. Just for a bit. See home. Maybe drive by her grandmother's house, maybe visit the old cemetery where generations of her family were buried. Just a sentimental detour. A pause inside the familiar. Except, when she pulled off the exit, Riverside wasn't there. The streets were wrong, the air felt heavy, dense, almost resistant, like breathing through memory instead of oxygen. And the town looked hollow, flat, almost staged. And somewhere deep inside, before language could catch up, Carol understood something with unsettling clarity. She wasn't where she was supposed to be. This is the story of Carol Chase McElheney and the day her hometown didn't exist. Welcome back to Time Slipped, the podcast where the past, present, and future occasionally forget whose turn it is. I'm your host, Nikki Rich. If you're enjoying the show, take a second to subscribe, share it with someone who loves a good rabbit hole, and follow along on YouTube for more stories like this. Today's story asks a question most of us never think to ask. What if your hometown didn't recognize you? Because home is supposed to be the one place that remembers us, even when we've forgotten ourselves. Carol expected Riverside to feel like home. Instead, it felt off in a way she couldn't immediately name. The exit signs were correct. The hills still curved the way they always had. At first glance, the geography lined up. But when she turned onto her grandmother's street, the illusion collapsed. Her house wasn't there. Neither were the neighbors' homes. Instead, sagging structures with boarded windows, chain link fences buckling under weeds, paint peeled so thoroughly it felt less like aging and more like erasure. The architecture looked old, but not historic, neglected, but not recently abandoned, like a neighborhood that had simply been left behind. Carol drove slowly, and not because she was lost, but because something in her body had already registered the wrongness. This wasn't her Riverside. It felt like Riverside, but rendered from a memory instead of reality. A photocopy of a photocopy. Edges blurred, details unreliable. In folklore, there's a term for places like this. Phantom settlements. Towns that appear where they shouldn't. Places familiar enough to trust until you stay too long. Carol didn't have a theory. She just knew one thing. Whatever this place was, it wasn't home, and it wasn't meant for her. Still attempting to cling to logic, Carol drove to the local cemetery, the one where her family had been buried for generations. If anything could anchor her, it would be that. But the gate was sealed shut. The archway had rusted into itself. The sign was so weathered, it was unreadable. Grass grew waist-high, unchecked, swallowing the paths that should have led through. Inside, headstones lay toppled and broken, some half buried, others tipped over like they'd been forgotten mid-thought. Cemeteries are supposed to stabilize you, They're proof that your story didn't start with you. But standing there, Carol felt that certainty slip. There were no familiar names, no markers that connected her to the place she knew. It felt like arriving late to something that had already ended, as if her family's presence had been erased so completely that even the land no longer remembered them. And this is the point where most people would turn around, not because they were afraid, but because staying starts to feel like trespassing. Carol had a flip phone. It was 2006, so think a Motorola, maybe a Nokia. Nothing sleek, nothing smart, but it worked. She could have taken a photo. That's obvious now. But in the moment, the thought didn't arrive cleanly. It surfaced slowly, like something swimming up from deep water, and then stalled. When she reached for the phone, her fingers went numb. Not painfully, just distant. Her thoughts slowed, then scattered, like her mind had hit buffering, waiting for something that never quite loaded. There was no warning, no fear spike, just a subtle resistance, like a moving through thick air. And this shows up again and again in time slip accounts. People forget to document, or hesitate without knowing why, or later realize the thought never fully formed until it was already gone. It's one of the strangest consistencies, that whatever these places are, they don't seem to like evidence. Carol stood there a moment longer, then the feeling shifted. Not relief, urgency. She turned back to her car, without fully deciding to, and drove away with a quiet certainty that staying longer would have been a mistake. Time passed. Life moved forward in the ordinary way it always does. Jobs, relationships, routine settling into place. And eventually, Carol found herself back in Riverside. This time, everything was normal. The streets were busy, the houses painted and occupied. Her grandmother's home stood exactly where it had always been. The cemetery gate was open, the grounds maintained, her family's graves undisturbed, names intact, dates lining up exactly as they should. There were no gaps, no signs of redevelopment, no record of anything ever having been wrong. Riverside hadn't noticed her absence, hadn't noticed anything at all. And that was almost worse, because if the place had changed, there might have been a reason. A fire, a flood, a forgotten rezoning decision. But nothing had happened. The world hadn't corrected itself. It had simply continued, which left Carol alone with the question that never stopped echoing. If she hadn't imagined it, if she hadn't misremembered, then where had she been? And just as unsettling, how easily had the world let her back in? This is usually where the mind starts searching for traction. Because when something like this happens, you feel it immediately. That need for the story to load, for the moment to resolve into something usable. Carol knew that route the way you know the drive home at night. Half asleep, hands moving before you think. What failed that day wasn't memory, it was recognition, like reaching for something familiar and finding nothing there to meet you. Some people believe she slipped into a parallel version of Riverside. Same streets, same layout, a place running alongside ours, but quieter, heavier. I could get behind that. Others think it wasn't time at all, that it was perception, a brief misalignment, a moment where the mind tuned into a version of the world that usually stays out of reach, a future where her family's presence had already thinned, not erased violently, just moved past. No ghosts, just absence. And then there's the explanation we joke about, the Mandela effect. Usually we're referring to logos, movie quotes, song lyrics, small things, safe things. But memory glitches stop being funny when they involve places, or lineage, or proof that you belonged somewhere. Maybe sometimes the problem isn't faulty recall. Maybe it's remembering something the world no longer carries cleanly, like a file that won't open, or a moment that buffers and never quite loads. And for just a moment, Carol stood inside that pause. Folklorists call these thin places, areas where reality feels worn down, like the fabric rubbed thin by repetition. But maybe the danger isn't dimensional. Maybe it's emotional. Because nostalgia is its own kind of portal. It promises comfort, a familiar street, a version of yourself that still belongs somewhere. And sometimes, if you follow it too far, it leads you somewhere that only looks like home. Carol never wrote a book, never sold her story. She told it a few times and then stopped, because she didn't want people to think she was crazy. Even after everything looked right again, she said she still could feel it. Maybe she was in the wrong version of home, because home is only real as long as it remembers you back. That's it for this episode of Time Slipped. If you've experienced something similar, you can send your story to glitch@timeslippedpod.com. You can also find video versions of these stories on YouTube. Thanks for listening. I'm Nikki Rich. We'll see you next time.